Hello, my dear friends. I have a short but I think very meaningful thought on this week's Parsha. After the splitting of the sea, the Chumash relates a series of episodes where the Jews were mislonain. They were complainers. They complained that they didn't have water. They complained that they didn't have bread. They complained that they didn't have meat. And the Torah introduces these complaints by saying, Vayilonu, they complained, al Moshe, on Moshe, or against Moshe. And that, or the second time, Vayilonu al Moshe ve'al Aharon. They complained against Moshe and Aharon. So I have a simple question to pose, and that is, why does the Torah say they complained al Moshe? They complained on Moshe or on Aharon. The Torah should have said they complained to El Moshe, el Aharon. Like, for example, when the Torah says that God spoke to Moshe, it's Vayidaber Hashem El Moshe, to Moshe, not al Moshe, but to Moshe. So people had a complaint. They needed water, they needed bread, they needed meat. So they should have complained to Moshe, not al Moshe, which literally means on Moshe. What does it mean? So the article translates it against Moshe. But nonetheless, why doesn't the Torah say, Vayilonu el Moshe el Aharon? And I would like to suggest the following based on an story that I heard from Rabbi Mati Miller, who resides in our community, and he is a terrific educator. He was a Rabbi for many years, and he told me the following story. He was chaperoning a group of his students. I think it was maybe an 8th grade trip, and they traveled to a certain location, and then overnight they stayed in a hotel. And in the evening, Rabbi Miller is musical. He plays an instrument, plays the guitar. So he had a kumsitz with the kids that were with him. They sat in the hotel lobby, and he was playing the guitar. And in between songs, they were singing along. In between songs, he was offering different Torah thoughts and different inspirational suggestions that he was making to these young people. So he's in a hotel lobby, and I think he said it was down south someplace, and there was a group of black teenagers with the head wraps on their heads, and they saw Rabbi Miller playing the guitar. They were very musical, these young people, and they sat and they were enjoying the kumsitz as well. It was a little bit strange. But listen, if they want to be part of the kumsitz, so Rabbi Miller didn't ask them to leave, and they sat there off to the side, listening to the music, and maybe swaying with it as well. And then they were listening to the words of inspiration, the divrei musar that Rabbi Miller was offering his talmidim. After the end of the kumsitz, Rabbi Miller went around the room and asked the young people in his group to talk about what they feel they had gained from the trip the past few days. And to Rabbi Miller and everybody else's great surprise, one of these young black teenagers stood up and he says, "Rabbi, I would like to say something as well." Well, he didn't know what the fellow was going to say. He was a little bit trepidatious, but to be courteous, he said, "Sure, by all means." So the fellow said, "Rabbi, we loved your music, and we also loved your inspirational words. And you know why? Because much of the time, people talk onto us, on top of us. You talked to us. You talked straight to our heart." And the point that this young man was making was very profound, and that is that when we talk to people, let's say sometimes we want to convey inspiration or musar, either to our children or if we're rebbeim, to our talmidim, if we're rabbis, to the congregants, we often have a tendency to talking on the people and not to the people. What does it mean to talk on the people? It means that we have what we want to say, and we don't connect to the person's heart. Instead, it's like we fly an airplane over their heads, and we open up the belly of the plane, and we drop whatever it is that we have to say. We drop it on, it lands on their head. If you want to move somebody, if you want to touch them, you can't talk on their heads. When you talk on somebody's head, it goes over the head. It never lands. The person has to talk to the heart of the individual. The problem with the Jewish people was they had legitimate complaints. They needed to have water, they needed to have bread, they needed to have food. But they needed to express it as talking to Moshe. Vayigonu el Moshe. They should have spoken to Moshe. But instead, because they were so upset about the situation, they spoke on Moshe. They didn't connect to the individual. They spoke over his head. And when you want to have an influence on somebody, especially if you're making a request, it's not sufficient to talk on the person. You have to talk to the person. The fact that the words land someplace, the person's earlobe, that's worthless. You have to talk to the person in order to have a influence. And this is true not only where we want to inspire others, and we're all in that role as we all have an influence on other people, but it's also it is a typical problem when there is a machlokas. When people get into an argument, if they want to have conflict resolution, the way to do so is to talk to the person. And the only way you could talk to the person is by hearing what they have to say and validating it and say, I understand your point. I understand where you're coming from. And then you could talk to the person. Then your words will penetrate the person's heart. But if you're just upset and angry and you let out steam, that such as the Jewish people in the desert, they were complaining. They were upset about the situation. They needed to talk to Moshe. They needed to get their message through to Moshe. Instead, because of their anger, they ended up talking al Moshe. They talked on top of Moshe. They flew right over like a helicopter flying overhead. That's how they spoke to Moshe. And therefore, it was ineffective. And in conflict resolution, one has to talk to the individual. You have to hear what the other person has to say. You have to listen to his or her position, and you have to validate it. And then you could talk to the person. And another point is that when you want to if a person is trying to resolve a conflict, it has to be without anger. Because if there's anger, it guarantees that the conversation will be over the person, al, and not el. Because when you're angry, it's not possible to connect to the other person's heart. It's going to be, you're throwing words at the person, but it's going to be on the person and not to the person. I often say that email is a very poor mode of communication. It's good for conveying facts. If you want to tell somebody how much money you're willing to pay for their used car, you could send an email. If you want to send a shopping list to one of your family members who's in the supermarket, email is fine, email or text. But when you want to have a real conversation, email is ineffective, because especially if there's a conflict that needs to be resolved and people resort, this is the new thing. Instead of talking to the person, people talk, they don't even talk to the person. They send an email. That's a lower level than speaking on the person, of shooting words over the person's head and hoping that it just sinks in and falls down on the person's head and gets absorbed. Email is not even that level, because it's so impersonal. And I see this all the time, that people are upset about things and they want to make their point be known and they want to influence the other person, but they do it by email or by text message. That is such an ineffective way of communicating with each other. I've often said we have more communication today than ever since the beginning of Brias Olam, because the flood of communications through email and text messages and WhatsApp and Instagram and all the other social media, there's in geometrical proportions. There are scores of more communications than there were in the past, but those communications. The way I would say it is, we have more communications, but we have far less communication, because true communication means talking the person, talking to the person. It's almost impossible to talk to the person if you're not talking face to face. Sometimes with a letter could also be powerful, but a letter has the old letter. Remember, those of you who are my age, you remember when we used to write with pens and on paper, and we used to put it in an envelope and put on a stamp and mail it. Those were called, for those of you that are younger and don't know, those are called letters. So we used to send letters. A letter could also have an impact, because a letter has a certain flavor to it, and a letter carries a certain emotion, and that's also a good way to communicate. But email is or all these other forms of modern communication is highly impersonal. And certainly if there's a conflict that needs to be resolved, and people oftentimes they'll send that, and they'll have an email group, and they'll have 10 people weighing in on a situation. Everybody is this statement and that statement, and this one's upset and that one's upset. Nothing ever gets resolved in that manner, because it's talking it's just shooting an electronic communication over the person's head, but it's not talking to the heart of the individual, to the individual. And that, I think, is a tremendous lesson. It's one word in the Torah. Each word in the Torah is so rich in meaning. When they spoke to Moshe Rabbeinu, they were angry and they were upset. And that's why it says Vayilonu, because they were complaining. They didn't just go to Moshe and say, we have a big problem. We need water. Could you please daven to Hashem? They complained. And because they were complaining, which reflects that they were the emotion that they had, so they spoke al Moshe. They spoke on Moshe. And that is the wrong way to communicate. Communication has to be especially when there's a problem, or if we want to influence somebody else, children, talmidim, friends, it always has to be El Moshe, or El whoever it is that we're speaking to. We have to speak to the person. And you see how Rabbi Miller, even with a group of strangers that they weren't part of his yeshiva, and they were black teenagers from a whole different background, but nonetheless, the message got through. It was done so powerfully. He wasn't even talking to them. He was talking to his talmidim. But they heard him speaking, and this young black person made such a profound statement that, Rabbi, most people talk over our heads, but you talked to us. You talked to our hearts. And that is the most effective way to have an influence on other people.